Barclay is with us now. Hello, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I suppose you want to start with an apology to the British public.
We moved quickly in response to the vaccine. Obviously, this report has just come out, so we want to look at it and consider it. That's why we've also got an inquiry to ensure that where there are lessons to learn, we do so. But we followed throughout the scientific advice. We got the vaccine deployed extremely quickly. We protected our NHS from the surge of cases. But of course, if there are lessons to learn, we're keen to do so.
Keen to start with an apology, though, I would have thought.
Well, no, we followed the scientific advice.
So no apology?
We followed the scientific advice. We protected the NHS.
20,000 lives needlessly lost because you didn't lock down a week earlier and you don't want to apologise?
Well, the issue of the timing of the lockdown was based on the evidence and the scientific advice at the time. The concern was if we locked down too soon, there wouldn't be a willingness to lock down for a long period of time. But it's right, Kay, that we look in the inquiry at what lessons there are to learn and ensure that we learn from them.
No apology that we were told by the then Health Secretary that there was a protective ring around care homes, and we know that that not to be the case.
Well, the decisions were taken on the evidence and the scientific advice at the time. They were taken to protect the NHS, but the government took decisions at the time based on the scientific advice it received, but those scientists themselves were operating in a very new environment where they themselves were learning about the pandemic.
I don't understand why you don't want to apologise.
Well, there are lessons to learn, but the point is that we took decisions based on the science.
There were 20,000 unnecessary deaths in the United Kingdom, many of them elderly people, and you don't want to apologise.
Well, what I'm saying, Kay, is did we take decisions based on the scientific evidence we were protected?
Why did we save lives? We're sorry.
Did we save lives through deploying the vaccine at pace far quicker than many comparable countries?
20,000 needless deaths, according to the report. You don't need to go through the whole, hefty report in order to know that it says that 20,000 people died needlessly, many of them elderly and infirm. Are you not sorry about that?
Well, this is why we're taking decisions, for example, around social care
say, yes,
patients.
We are sorry?
Well, there will be lessons, and of course, where there's lessons, we're keen to take that on board. The fundamental point within your question is, are there lessons for us to learn from what happened at the pandemic?
That's not
and the
my
answer
question.
to that is we will learn the lessons.
Minister, that's not my question, with respect. What I'm saying is that 20,000 families watching this morning probably lost a loved one. They couldn't go to the funerals because either they weren't allowed at all or there was an extended family and they couldn't all go. We saw a young man who was lowered into the ground and his family couldn't be there and they had to watch it on Zoom. 20,000 times that happened needlessly. How can you not say you're sorry?
Well, that is heartbreaking. That impact on families, that impact in terms of people's funerals is heartbreaking. And I think all of us feel that. All of us have friends and neighbours who were in that situation.
I don't want to apologise on behalf of the government. Joining us now is the Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray. Mr Murray, good morning. Do you think that the Minister should have apologised?
I think the government needs to take responsibility, and that's across the piece. There is going to be so many lessons to learn from what the government did during COVID and what they failed to do. And, what we've seen in this report is damning. I think a lot more is going to come out with the public inquiry. And I think there will be a whole number of ways in which the government needs to take responsibility for what happened. I remember back last year, we didn't know how it was going to pan out, but we could see some of the things happening in care homes, for instance, where people were not being protected in care homes. The PPE just wasn't there. I knew that as a constituency MP, as well as at the time a member of the Health Select Committee. And we saw the fact that people were not being protected. We saw people being discharged into care homes, and we saw what happened there. That's just one example. But across the piece, the families of all of those who died need the government to take responsibility for their actions.
We were told that if we had locked down a week earlier, then many, many thousands of lives would have been saved. Keir Starmer at the time supported when we locked down. Is it also an opportunity perhaps for you this morning to apologise on behalf of Labour?
I think everyone will reflect on what happened during the outbreak. And if you see what happened as things went on, it became clear that we need to take action quickly and decisively to get on top of the the virus. And as we saw toward the end of the summer, Keir Starmer called for a circuit breaker to try and halt the rise in cases then, and the government prevaricated again. So at the beginning of the outbreak, you might have said, well, it's new, people are still getting their heads around how it works, and I'm sure the government will say that. But it was very clear as the outbreak went on, and as it became clear how the virus transmitted and how the virus got throughout society, the government was still reluctant, still held back from taking those decisive measures quick enough. And so if you remember, it was toward the end of summer, September last year, when Keir Starmer called for that short circuit break. The government held back, things got worse. And at every stage, what we saw, both in terms of the health responses and as well the economic responses, all the financial support that people had needed, the government was too slow and too late at every turn.
And in answer to my question?
As I said, I'm sure there will be a lot of consideration about what people said and how things were handled, but the government ultimately has to take responsibility for what they did and what is crucially what they did not do.
Yeah, but as I pointed out, Sir Keir was supporting what the government had decided to do with lockdown in the early stages. As a result, many thousands of people died who would not have done if we'd locked down a week earlier. I don't understand why politicians don't want to say to my viewers, we are sorry for every death.
Well, every death is awful and shocking, and I know that as a constituency MP, as well as someone on the shadow front bench. I think what's really crucial, though, is that the government have the information, they have access to the scientific advice, they also have access to wider information about what's going on, and it is up to them to take decisions about how to respond to the pandemic. And now, as we begin to look back, they need to take responsibility.
I don't understand why sorry seems to be the hardest word for politicians on my programme this morning.
What I'm saying is the government needs to take responsibility for the decisions.
Yeah, I get that, and I challenge them on that. I'm asking whether Labour wants to accept any responsibility whatsoever about the fact that we didn't lock down a week earlier. You didn't hold the Prime Minister's feet to the flame. In fact, your leader supported him at that time. You must be in some way sorry.
Well, actually, I think if you remember the timing, the first lockdown came before Keir Starmer became leader of the party, if I'm remembering that correctly. But actually, if you look at when Keir Starmer was the leader later in the summer, when there was after the end of the summer, and we were looking at how the pandemic might pan out into the autumn, Keir Starmer called for a circuit break, and the government did not do that. Keir was very clear that we need to act quickly, and we need to make sure we have that circuit break to prevent infections from spiralling.
Correcting me on who was leader at the time. Correcting me on who was leader at the time, as opposed to saying, yeah, these people died and they wouldn't have done if we'd locked down a week earlier. And we, as the opposition, have to accept some responsibility for not pushing the government to a lockdown a week earlier when that's what we were being told, not only in the UK, but in other countries around the world. Surely there must be some sense of wanting to apologise to those 20,000 families who lost their loved ones unnecessarily. Surely.
Well, I think everyone will think about what they were saying and doing at the time. I was a member of the Health Select Committee myself at the time, and I remember us looking at the evidence coming in and being concerned about what the government's response was. I think this is a really important point, though, which is that the government had access to the scientific information. They had an overview of the wider situation going on. They could see what was happening in other countries, and they decided to lock down too late. And importantly, to add to that as well, it wasn't just the beginning, it's also a pattern that repeated itself. I'm sure the government will say that at the beginning of the outbreak, people did not know exactly how this virus was going to spread and what was going to happen. But as time went on, it became very clear that we needed to act quickly and decisively to get on top of infections. And that is not what happened when we went into the autumn, both in terms of the health measures and in terms of the financial support available to people.
So Labour's not sorry at all in any way for their part in the lockdown not happening a week earlier?
as I say, the government were
Why can't you
in
just
charge.
say sorry? I don't get why you can't just say sorry. It's staggering to me and staggering to my viewers, I'm sure, that you can't just say we are sorry for any unnecessary deaths.
I think any unnecessary deaths are shocking and awful. And I have been advocating on behalf of constituents of mine who lost family members during the outbreak, as well as my role on the shadow front bench. What I'm saying is that the government needs to take responsibility for what happened. They need to make sure they take responsibility for what happened in terms of lockdown, and as well as what happened in care homes and other parts of society that were affected by what happened during the outbreak.
Okay, thank you for joining us on the programme this morning. Thank